The Kansas Reflector staff is taking a look back at 2025 to share their favorite stories and what you all read the most.
You know, I have a hard time picking my favorite story. There's so many this year. And I think about favorites in various ways. So one of my favorites, just for kind of finding a different way to approach this, was how I covered the No Kings rally back in, I think it was November. This was, you know, obviously No Kings rallies all across the country. There were going to be thousands of people at the State House in Topeka. But I had covered something very similar to that over the summer. And I knew that it was just going to be kind of the same story that people everywhere were writing. A bunch of people get together at the state houses and say, we don't like the president. You know, it's a big deal, but I don't mean to minimize that. It's just the same story being told over and over again. So I found out that there is going to be a small gathering in a very small town of Cottonwood Falls, which is also in Chase County, where there's a jail that has a contract with ICE. And so one of the only places in Kansas where they can take detainees, the immigrants that they're picking up. And there's somebody in that town who has just kind of made it her mission to support the immigrants who are being held there. They're basically being held for just a few days or a couple of weeks before they're moved on somewhere else. And a lot of them aren't even there long enough to get like a federal number assigned to them. So if they don't have a way to communicate immediately with their families sometimes lose track of them. They don't know where they are. And so this woman in Cottonwood Falls was gathering community support donations just to kind of make their stay a little bit better, providing things like soccer balls, other items that she could that are allowed inside the jail, and also giving them, you know, postcards and stamps, a way to communicate with people so that they could tell them what's happening to them. She was having a No Kings rally, which turned out to be like 12 hippies around a campfire in her backyard in this small town. I think, you know, one of the more serious stories that I covered that I would point to dealt with the conflict raging at the Board of Indigent Defense Services. That's just a government bureaucracy speak for public defenders. This is an agency that handles the vast majority of criminal defense cases because people can't afford an attorney. And there's conflict in terms of, you know, an array of personnel investigations, secret hirings, disputes over who is qualified to handle which case. There was somebody who was fired by voicemail. She was in charge of a whole department. And I was able to get documents, a copy of that voicemail, things that could really shine a light on what was happening behind the scenes, and really look at this through the broader lens of what happens when the legislature severely underfunds an agency for decades and decades. Earlier in the year, the director of this agency had basically just quit and threw her hands in the air and said, you know, I can't deal with this mess anymore. And she had warned that there was going to be this kind of crisis looming if something didn't happen. The legislature actually cut their budget, even though they were already underfunded. And so the reason why this becomes such a major deal is this infighting infected a capital murder case to the point that this defendant now has a clear argument to say he didn't receive effective assistance of counsel, which means his case, his conviction could be reopened and at least endlessly litigated at great expense to taxpayers, to the detriment of the families who are affected by the victims in that case. The victims' families who are affected in that case. So this came to a head before a retired judge that the Supreme Court assigned to take over this case. He read him the Riot Act. He dismissed the attorneys that this agency had assigned and appointed new attorneys from outside the agency. But he also kind of shockingly pointed to an inherent problem at this agency, which is you have the same agency handling cases at the trial level and at the appeals level. And that makes it an issue because you're supposed to have, you know, one of your defenses at the appeals level is that you didn't get proper assistance earlier in the case. And that can also be true for the appeals as you go through that appeals process. And so how can you trust an agency to say that my colleague down the hall shouldn't be working here? They're not good enough to handle this. You know, for the judge, this seems like an inherent conflict of interest that shouldn't exist. And I think this is a situation that we're going to have to pay attention to throughout the next year.